My name is Rachel, and I'm in my early 30s. Today, I want to share a story about a time my family didn't just fail to support me, they actively denied the existence of my pain. They told me my sorrow wasn't real, that my grief was invalid, and what happened next was me finding a way to scream my truth into existence, even if they refused to hear it. Stick around, and I'll tell you the whole story of how I took my denied sorrow and turned it into a public art exhibition. If you've ever felt misunderstood or invalidated by the people who are supposed to love you most, please hit that like button and let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if my story resonates, consider subscribing for more journeys through navigating difficult relationships. Growing up, my family on the surface seemed relatively normal. We had holiday traditions, shared meals, the usual rhythm of family life. But beneath the surface, there was always a current of subtle control and a strange, unspoken hierarchy of emotions. My parents, particularly my mother, had a way of dictating the emotional landscape. Certain feelings were acceptable: happiness, pride in achievements, mild frustration over trivial things. Other feelings were not. Deep sadness, anger directed at them, vulnerability that wasn't carefully curated for sympathy. These were met with discomfort, deflection, or outright dismissal. I learned early that my more profound feelings were inconvenient. If I cried hard about something that wasn't deemed worth that level of tears, I was told I was being overly sensitive, dramatic, or manipulative. My siblings picked up on this cue, either adopting the same dismissive attitude or, in my younger brother's case, withdrawing entirely when things got emotionally complex. There was a performance required. Happy, compliant, untroubled Rachel was the preferred version. The real Rachel, with her anxieties and deep emotional responses, was often hidden away, even from myself. This pattern wasn't violent or overtly cruel in the way some stories describe toxic families, but it was insidious. It was a constant, subtle erosion of my sense of self-worth and the validity of my own internal world. I learned to tamp down my reactions, to preface difficult conversations with apologies for being a burden, to question if what I was feeling was too much. It was a slow, quiet kind of emotional neglect, dressed up in the guise of keeping the peace and maintaining a pleasant family facade. For years, I navigated this, minimizing myself to fit the mold, believing that maybe they were right, maybe I was just too sensitive. I built a life outside the family sphere where I could be more myself, where friends validated my experiences and didn't flinch from my feelings. This external support was a lifeline I didn't fully appreciate the necessity of until the ground truly fell out from under me. The event that triggered the central conflict wasn't a death, though the grief felt just as profound. It was the end of a relationship that had been the cornerstone of my adult life for nearly a decade. Mark and I had met in college, built a life together from scratch. Our relationship was deep, intertwined, and utterly central to my identity. We weren't just partners. We were best friends, confidants. Our families were connected. Our futures seemed inextricably linked. When it ended, abruptly and painfully due to circumstances that felt beyond my control, it wasn't just a breakup. It was an amputation of a future I had meticulously planned and a present I deeply cherished. The immediate aftermath was a physical ache. My chest felt hollow. Breathing was difficult. The world outside my apartment felt muted and distant. The grief was a heavy cloak that settled over everything. I lost weight, struggled to sleep, found it hard to focus on work. My friends rallied around me, offering comfort, listening for hours, bringing food, sitting with me in the silence. They saw the depth of my pain, the magnitude of a loss. They treated it with the solemnity it deserved. Naturally, I turned to my family. These were the people who had known Mark for almost as long as they'd known me in adulthood. He had been at every family gathering, every holiday, every significant event. He was, to me, family. I thought surely they would understand the devastation. I was wrong. I called my mother first, tears streaming down my face, struggling to articulate the sheer scale of the emptiness I felt. I expected comfort, a listening ear, maybe even shared sadness for the loss of Mark from their lives, as he had been close to them too. Instead, her voice was cool, almost detached. "Oh, Rachel. Well, these things happen. You're young. You'll find someone else." I remember choking back a sob. "Mom, it's not just finding someone else. It was 10 years. It was my life." 10 years isn't that long in the grand scheme of things, she said lightly, as if discussing a minor inconvenience. "Think of it as a fresh start. A new chapter." A fresh start? A new chapter? My world had just been destroyed, and she was talking about it like redecorating a room. There was no acknowledgement of the pain, no empathy for the lost future, no recognition of Mark's significance or the decade of shared history. It was as if she had decided my relationship, and therefore my grief over its ending, was simply not important enough to warrant genuine sorrow. I tried talking to my father, hoping for a different reaction. He was less overtly dismissive, but equally unhelpful. He defaulted to practical advice. "Well, you'll need to sort out who gets what. Have you thought about moving? It's probably for the best you don't stay in that apartment." He focused entirely on the logistical fallout, completely bypassing the emotional crater left behind. When I tried to express the emotional pain, he'd just nod slowly, his eyes glazing over, or offer platitudes like, "Time heals all wounds, honey," delivered with the emotional depth of a fortune cookie. My siblings mirrored my parents. My older sister, Sarah, who was usually the most pragmatic, offered unsolicited advice that felt like judgment. "Honestly, Rachel, I never really saw you two ending up together forever anyway. You were so different. We had built a life that everyone, including her, had praised." It felt like a retroactive rewriting of history to justify her lack of sympathy. She then quickly pivoted to gossip about mutual acquaintances, clearly uncomfortable dwelling on my sadness. My younger brother, David, true to form, just clammed up. When I mentioned the breakup, he mumbled something about being sorry and quickly changed the subject to a video game he was playing. There was no curiosity about how I was feeling, no offer of support, just awkward silence and a swift exit from the conversation. Their reactions weren't just unsupportive, they were actively invalidating. It wasn't just that they didn't know what to say, it was that they seemed determined not to acknowledge the reality of my pain. Every conversation left me feeling worse, more isolated, more convinced that maybe I was, in fact, overreacting. But my body and my heart screamed that I wasn't. The depth of the grief was undeniable to me. I pulled back from them. It hurt too much to share my pain only to have it minimized or ignored. I relied heavily on my friends, who continued to be incredible. They let me grieve messy, ugly, and loud. They didn't try to fix it, they just sat with me in the mess. But the invalidation from my family festered. It wasn't just about the breakup anymore. It became about a lifetime of feeling that my emotional reality was somehow lesser, less important, less real than theirs. It was about the deep-seated need for the people who raised me to finally see me, truly see the depth of my feelings, both good and bad. Over the next few months, my family's behavior escalated from mere lack of support to active misrepresentation. Since I wasn't sharing my genuine pain with them, they seemed to fill the vacuum with their own narratives. I started hearing from extended family members, distant aunts and uncles, who had heard simplified, distorted versions of events. "Oh, your mother said you're taking the breakup pretty hard, but you're bouncing back quickly." Or, "I heard you, and Mark just grew apart. It was mutual, right?" It felt like they were spinning a story where I was coping beautifully, where the breakup was amicable and expected, where my decade-long relationship was just a minor footnote. This public facade they were creating felt like a second betrayal. They weren't just denying my sorrow to me, they were denying it to the world, boxing me into a narrative of easy resilience that felt like a cruel joke when I was struggling to get out of bed each morning. One particularly hurtful incident happened at a distant cousin's wedding. My mother saw me looking a bit quiet, and instead of asking how I was, she stage whispered to an aunt, loud enough for me to hear, "Rachel's just being a bit moody. You know how she gets. Drama." My genuine, soul-deep grief was labeled as drama. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I wasn't just hurt anymore, I was angry. an anger that was cold and clear, unlike the hot mess of my grief. I realized I was never going to get the validation I craved from them through conventional means. Talking hadn't worked. Crying hadn't worked. Explaining hadn't worked. They had built a wall around their perception of me, and they weren't willing to see beyond it. They wanted the easy, untroubled daughter, and they were willing to erase my real pain to maintain that image, both for themselves and for their social circle. I stopped trying to explain. I stopped trying to gain their sympathy. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but now it was tinged with indignation. I needed an outlet, a way to process this overwhelming emotional experience that had been compounded by my family's reaction. My friends continued to be pillars of support, but I needed something more, something for me. I had always found solace in art, though I wasn't a professional artist. I painted and sketched as a hobby, mostly for my own enjoyment. In the weeks following that wedding incident, an idea began to form, hazy at first, then crystallizing into something concrete. What if I could translate this grief, this complex tapestry of sorrow, anger, confusion, and isolation, into something tangible, something visual? What if I created art that was my grief? The idea of an exhibition came later, almost as an afterthought. At first, it was just about making the art for myself. I bought canvases, paints, clay, charcoal, anything that felt like it could hold the weight of my emotions. I set up a small corner in my apartment, the one that used to be filled with reminders of my life with Mark, and turned it into a studio. I started small, sketching chaotic lines and dark shapes. It felt raw, primal. There was no planning, no attempt at technical perfection. It was just about getting the feeling out of my body and onto the canvas. The first few pieces were dark and heavy, reflecting the immediate shock and despair. Swirls of black and gray, jagged lines that felt like tearing, figures hunched over or fragmented. One piece, I remember vividly, was a large canvas covered in layers of deep blues and purples, with streaks of angry red slashed across it. I called it Silent Scream. It represented the internal agony I felt, the scream that was trapped inside because I had learned not to voice my pain, especially to my family. Painting it was physically exhausting, like pulling the emotions out of my gut with a brush. Another piece involved clay. I sculpted distorted figures, twisted and broken, some reaching out to empty space. They represented the feeling of being fragmented, of losing a part of myself, and the desperate longing for connection that was no longer there, both with Mark and with my family. Working with the clay was grounding, the cool, malleable material a strange contrast to the fiery emotions it was expressing. As I continued to create, my art began to evolve, mirroring the slow, nonlinear process of grief itself. There were pieces that reflected specific memories, distorted and aching. There were pieces filled with sharp edges and angry colors, born from the frustration and hurt caused by my family's reaction. There were pieces that explored the feeling of invisibility, of being seen, but not truly perceived. One painting, titled Unseen, depicted a figure wrapped in shadows, reaching out towards faint, distant lights that seemed to ignore it. It was a direct expression of how it felt to be actively dismissed, to have my pain rendered invisible by the people I needed to see it most. I didn't censor myself. I painted the loneliness, the anger, the confusion, the lingering love, the sense of betrayal. Each piece was a conversation with myself, a validation of my own experience. It was also, perhaps unconsciously at first, a silent argument against the narrative my family was spinning. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. This was soul-shattering. This wasn't drama. This was profound pain. As the weeks turned into months, I accumulated a significant body of work. My small apartment studio was filling up. Friends who visited were struck by the intensity and raw emotion in the pieces. They encouraged me, telling me how powerful the art was, how much it spoke to them. Their reactions were another form of validation, a counterpoint to my family's dismissal. The idea of exhibiting the work started as a tentative suggestion from a friend. "You know, Rachel, you should show this. People need to see it." It's helping me understand what you went through. Initially, the thought terrified me. This art was so personal, so vulnerable. It felt like stripping bare my deepest wounds in public. And the thought of my family seeing it? That was a whole other level of fear. What would they say? Would they be angry? Embarrassed? Would they finally understand? Or would they just find another way to dismiss it? But the more I thought about it, the more the idea took hold. This art was my truth. It was proof of the invisible pain I carried, the pain that had been denied oxygen by my family. Maybe, just maybe, putting it out there wasn't about seeking their approval anymore. Maybe it was about planting my flag, declaring, this was real. My pain was real. I am real. It became less about getting them to understand, and more about self-validation and finding my voice. The exhibition could be a culmination of my journey through grief and dismissal, a statement that I had processed this, I had survived this, and I was no longer hiding. I found a small, local gallery space willing to host a short exhibition for emerging artists. I worked with the curator, carefully selecting the pieces that best told the story of the loss, the story of the family's reaction, the story of the lonely process of healing, and the story of finding my voice through art. I wrote short descriptions for each piece, explaining the emotion or experience that inspired it, careful not to name names, but making the context clear enough for anyone who knew the situation to understand. The title I chose was simple and direct, Echoes of the Unseen. It reflected the feeling of my grief being an echo in an empty room, unheard and unseen by those closest to me. I sent out invitations. I invited my friends, of course. I also, after much internal debate, sent invitations to my family. I didn't expect them all to come. I didn't even know if I wanted them to come. Part of me hoped they wouldn't, to avoid the confrontation. But another part, the part that still yearned for some kind of acknowledgement, felt compelled to extend the invitation. It was their chance, perhaps their last chance, to witness the reality they had denied. The days leading up to the exhibition were a blur of nerves and last-minute preparations. Hanging the art felt intensely vulnerable. Each piece on the wall was a piece of my soul on display. Opening night arrived. My friends were there, supportive and loving. Seeing their faces, knowing they saw and validated my struggle, gave me strength. People I didn't know came, too, drawn by the raw titles or the intriguing premise. I talked to strangers about my work, finding unexpected connection with others who had experienced their own forms of denied grief. Then they arrived. My mother, my father, and my sister Sarah. David wasn't there. He had sent a text saying he was busy, which felt like another familiar form of avoidance. Seeing them walk in, my heart pounded. They looked uncomfortable, like they were unsure how to navigate this space that was so explicitly mine, so full of the emotions they had tried to pretend didn't exist. They did a stilted walkthrough, exchanging polite, generic comments about the gallery space itself, avoiding looking too closely at the art. My mother wore a tight smile. My father kept his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the ceiling as much as the walls. Sarah fidgeted with her purse. I watched them from across the room, a knot tightening in my stomach. Were they seeing it? Were they connecting the dots? Did the raw emotion radiating from the canvases pierce through their denial? They stopped in front of Silent Scream. My mother tilted her head. Interesting use of color, Rachel. Very. Expressive. That was it. No acknowledgement of the title. No question about the feeling it represented. Just a safe, generic comment about technique. My father grunted something non-committal about it being modern art, a phrase he uses to dismiss anything abstract. Sarah just nodded silently, her eyes flicking nervously towards me. They moved on to Unseen. I held my breath. This piece was the most direct representation of feeling invisible due to their actions. My mother glanced at the title card, then at the shadowy figure. She straightened her shoulders. A bit dark, isn't it? She said, loud enough for a few nearby patrons to hear. Rachel usually has such a cheerful disposition. I wonder what inspired this. That was it. The direct question, phrased innocently, but carrying the weight of months of denial. She was inviting me to provide a superficial explanation, something that wouldn't challenge her narrative of the cheerful daughter bouncing back. I walked over to them, my legs feeling shaky but my resolve hardening. This was the moment. The confrontation I had both dreaded and, deep down, perhaps orchestrated. It was inspired, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, by the feeling of having my deepest pain invisible to the people I wanted most to see it, by feeling unseen and unheard. My mother's smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Well, that's a rather dramatic interpretation, dear. Is it? I asked, looking directly at her. Or is it the truth that you've been unwilling to look at? My father shifted uncomfortably. Sarah looked away. Rachel, my mother said, her voice dropping to a low, controlled tone that I knew meant she was activating her defense mechanisms. We were just trying to help you move forward. You were dwelling.
Dwelm.
I repeated, the indignation rising. I was grieving. There's a difference. And your help felt like telling me my pain wasn't real, that I was inventing it. That's not fair, she retorted, her voice starting to edge up. We just thought it was best to look on the bright side. There was no bright side for a long time, Mom, and pretending there was didn't help me. It just made me feel more alone. You were never alone, my father interjected, his voice flat. We were here. Were you? I challenged, gesturing around the gallery. This is where my grief went when I couldn't share it with you. It went onto these canvases, into this clay, because you didn't make space for it. You labeled it drama. You told other people I was bouncing back when I was falling apart. That's not being here. That's actively looking away. My mother's face hardened. We don't need to have this discussion here, Rachel. This is hardly the time or place. Why not? I asked, my voice rising slightly. Because it's public? Because other people might hear? Isn't that the problem? You care more about appearances than about reality. That is absolutely uncalled for, she snapped, her controlled facade cracking. We came here to support you, even though we don't understand this. This exhibition, she swept a hand around the room dismissively. No, I said, shaking my head slowly. You came because you felt obligated. You don't understand it because you refuse to understand the pain it came from. There was a tense silence. Other gallery patrons were starting to glance over. My father put a hand on my mother's arm. All right, Rachel. We've seen the art.
It's
a lot. We'll let you get back to your guests. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't understanding. It was retreat. A hasty exit from the uncomfortable truth on display. They mumbled hurried goodbyes and quickly made their way out of the gallery, leaving me standing there, trembling, surrounded by the echoes of my pain made visible. It wasn't the cathartic reconciliation I might have, in some hidden corner of my heart, still wished for. They didn't suddenly see the light, weep, and apologize for decades of emotional neglect. But it was a confrontation. I had spoken my truth, directly and unequivocally, in a space I had created to honor that truth. I hadn't backed down. I hadn't apologized for my feelings. I had stood in my power, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my denied sorrow, and I had called them out. The immediate aftermath of the exhibition was complicated. My family was furious. My mother sent me a long, hurt email about how I had embarrassed her, how I had been ungrateful for their supposed support, and how I had twisted their intentions. She doubled down on the narrative that they had only wanted me to be happy and that my grief was an indulgence. My sister Sarah texted me, saying that while she understood I was hurting, I shouldn't have made a scene at the gallery. My father didn't contact me directly, but I heard from my aunt that he was upset I had aired family laundry in public. There was no breakthrough, no sudden moment of understanding on their part. The exhibition didn't magically fix our relationship. In some ways, it widened the chasm between us. They saw my art and my words not as an expression of pain or a plea for understanding, but as an accusation and attack. And perhaps, on some level, it was certainly a dismantling of the facade they preferred. But for me, the exhibition was profoundly healing, even without their validation. Creating the art had been a powerful process of acknowledging my grief and giving it form. Exhibiting it was an act of courage, a declaration of my right to feel what I felt, regardless of whether others approved. The response from people who weren't my family was overwhelmingly positive. Strangers approached me to share their own stories of grief, of feeling unseen, of struggling to articulate pain that didn't fit neatly into societal expectations. The gallery sold a few pieces, which was unexpected but validating in a different way, proof that my emotional experience resonated with others. The confrontation at the gallery, though painful, solidified my resolve. I saw clearly that my family was either unwilling or unable to meet me where I was emotionally. Their inability to acknowledge my grief was a symptom of a larger, deeper issue in our dynamic. I couldn't change them. I couldn't force them to be the supportive family I had always longed for. But I could change how I interacted with them. I started setting firm boundaries. I limited contact, especially with my mother, making it clear that conversations needed to be respectful and that I would not tolerate dismissiveness of my feelings. I learned to disengage when they started down their familiar paths of invalidation or control. It was difficult and often lonely. There were holidays I spent with friends instead of family, choosing emotional safety over obligation. There were phone calls that ended abruptly when boundaries were crossed. My relationship with my family became more distant, less frequent, and more carefully managed. There were still moments of connection, but they were often overshadowed by the underlying tension and the unspoken history of my denied grief. I accepted that I might never get the apology or the deep understanding I had once craved. My validation had to come from within and from the chosen family I had built around me. The art exhibition became a marker in time, a line drawn in the sand. It was the moment I stopped seeking their permission to grieve and gave myself that permission. It was the moment I stopped trying to fit myself into their narrow emotional box and chose to occupy my own space, messy and painful and real as it was. It taught me that grief doesn't follow a timeline or a rulebook, and its validity doesn't depend on external approval, not even from your closest family. It taught me the power of creative expression as a means of processing the unbearable. And most importantly, it taught me that sometimes the most powerful act of self-love is to boldly claim your own truth, even when the world, or your own family, tells you it doesn't exist. The echoes of that time still linger, but they are no longer deafening. They are reminders of how far I've come, from a place of quiet suffering and desperate yearning for validation to a place of self-acceptance and quiet strength. My family dynamic remains complex and often challenging, but I navigate it now with clearer boundaries and a deeper understanding that my emotional well-being is my responsibility, not theirs to grant or deny. Thank you for listening to my story. It takes courage to share these difficult experiences, but I believe there's power in speaking our truth, especially when it's been silenced. If anything in my story resonated with you, the feeling of denied grief, the struggle for validation, the difficult process of setting boundaries with family, please let me know in the comments below. Share your own experiences if you feel comfortable. Hit the like button if this story spoke to you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about navigating complex relationships and finding your voice. Your support means the world.